The year was 1968, and America was caught in the grip of a conflict that would define an entire generation. The jungles of Southeast Asia had become a maze of danger, where young men barely out of high school found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't see and a war they didn't fully understand. But this story isn't about the war everyone knows. This is about an operation so classified that even today, over 50 years later, the government barely acknowledges it existed. And at the center of it all was a 24-year-old medic from Kansas named Daniel Reed, a man whose name should be carved into monuments, but instead remains whispered only among those who were there. Daniel grew up in a small farming town outside of Topeka, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and Friday night football was the highlight of the week. He was the middle child of 5, raised by a father who worked at the grain elevator and a mother who taught Sunday school. Life was simple, predictable, and safe. Daniel had planned to take over his uncle's auto repair shop after graduating high school, maybe marry his girlfriend Sarah, and settle into the comfortable rhythm of small-town life. But in the summer of 1966, everything changed. His draft notice arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, tucked between a Sears catalog and the electric bill. His mother cried for 3 days straight. By January 1967, Daniel was at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, training to become a combat medic. He wasn't the fastest runner or the strongest soldier, but he had something that couldn't be taught in any military training program. He had an instinct for medicine, a calm under pressure that his instructors noticed immediately. While other trainees panicked during simulation exercises, Daniel moved with purpose and precision. His hands never shook, even when faced with the most gruesome mock injuries. One of his drill sergeants pulled him aside after a particularly intense training session and told him something he'd never forget. The sergeant said that some men are born to fight, and others are born to save lives, and Daniel was clearly the latter. Those words would prove prophetic in ways neither of them could imagine. By September 1967, Daniel was in Vietnam, assigned to a special forces unit operating out of a remote base near the Cambodian border. The official records would later show he was part of a standard medical support team. The reality was far different. His unit was part of a covert program designed to conduct cross-border operations into Cambodia, hunting down enemy supply lines and gathering intelligence. These missions didn't officially exist. The soldiers who conducted them were ghosts, and if something went wrong, the government would deny everything. Daniel knew the risks, but he also knew that his job was to keep his brothers alive, no matter what the political situation looked like back in Washington. The base itself was a collection of sandbag bunkers and corrugated metal buildings surrounded by triple layers of razor wire. At night, you could hear the distant thunder of artillery and see the orange glow of flares drifting lazily through the humid air. Daniel shared a tent with 3 other medics, but he was the only one regularly sent on the classified missions across the border. His commanding officer, a hard-faced captain from Georgia named Morrison, had specifically requested him for the assignment. Morrison had seen Daniel work during a firefight 2 months earlier, when their patrol had been ambushed and 3 men went down in the first 30 seconds. While everyone else hit the dirt and returned fire, Daniel had sprinted into the kill zone, dragged 2 wounded soldiers to cover, and kept them alive until the medevac helicopter arrived. Morrison knew that for the type of operations they were planning, they needed someone who wouldn't freeze when everything went sideways. The mission briefing happened on a moonless night in late October 1968. Daniel and 11 other soldiers crowded into a small room lit by a single naked bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Captain Morrison stood at the front with a map that showed terrain features but deliberately omitted any political borders. He didn't need to say where they were going. Everyone in that room knew they'd be crossing into Cambodia, a supposedly neutral country where American forces weren't supposed to be operating. Morrison explained that intelligence had located a major enemy staging area about 15 miles inside Cambodia. It was a logistics hub where weapons and supplies were being stored before being moved south along the trail. The mission was simple in theory, but brutal in execution. They would infiltrate at night, plant demolition charges, gather any intelligence they could find, and extract before dawn. Speed and stealth were everything. Daniel listened carefully, mentally cataloging what medical supplies he'd need to carry. In addition to his M16 rifle and basic combat gear, he'd be hauling over 40 pounds of medical equipment. Bandages, tourniquets, morphine syrettes, plasma bottles, surgical tools, antibiotics, and everything else he might need to keep someone alive in the middle of hostile territory with no possibility of immediate evacuation. Other soldiers could leave gear behind to move faster. Daniel couldn't afford that luxury. Every item in his aid bag represented a life he might be able to save. The team would insert by helicopter just after midnight, dropped in a clearing about 3 miles from the target. They'd move through the jungle on foot, hitting the objective around 0400 hours when enemy guards would be at their least alert. The demolition team would have 30 minutes to set their charges while the rest provided security. Then they'd move to the extraction point and get picked up before sunrise. Morrison made it sound routine, almost boring, but everyone in that room had been on enough of these missions to know that no operation ever went exactly according to plan. The jungle had a way of turning simple tasks into nightmares. After the briefing, Daniel went back to his tent and methodically checked every item in his medical kit. He'd developed a ritual over the months, a way of centering himself before going out. He'd touch each piece of equipment, making sure it was exactly where it needed to be, that he could find it by touch alone in complete darkness. His tent mate, a kid from Ohio named Parker, watched him work and asked if he ever got scared before these missions. Daniel thought about it for a moment before answering. He said fear was natural, but he'd learned to put it in a box and lock it away until the job was done. He couldn't afford to be scared when someone was bleeding out in front of him. There'd be plenty of time to be scared later, assuming they made it back. The helicopter ride into Cambodia was supposed to take 40 minutes. They flew low and fast, the pilots using night vision equipment to navigate through the darkness. Daniel sat near the open door, watching the jungle canopy blur past beneath them. The other soldiers were quiet, each man lost in his own thoughts. Some checked their weapons for the 10th time, others stared at nothing, their faces blank and unreadable. Daniel closed his eyes and thought about home, about his mother's kitchen and the smell of fresh bread baking on Saturday mornings. It was a trick he'd learned to calm his mind, to find a peaceful place inside himself before walking into hell. They were 10 minutes from the landing zone when everything went wrong. The night sky suddenly erupted with green tracer rounds arcing up from the jungle below. Someone had spotted them, and now they were taking heavy fire. The helicopter banked hard to the left, the pilot's voice crackling over the intercom, telling everyone to hold on. Daniel gripped the safety strap as the aircraft shuddered from multiple impacts. He could hear the distinct metallic pings of bullets striking the fuselage. One of the door gunners opened up with his machine gun, sending red tracers streaming down into the darkness. The smell of gunpowder filled the cabin. The pilot made a split-second decision that probably saved their lives. Instead of trying to reach the original landing zone, now clearly compromised, he dove for a small clearing about half a mile away. The helicopter came in hard and fast, bouncing twice before settling into the tall grass. Morrison was shouting for everyone to get out, to establish a perimeter, to move, move, move. Daniel jumped from the helicopter with the others, immediately dropping into a crouch as the aircraft lifted off behind them. The sound of the rotors faded quickly, leaving them in sudden, oppressive silence. They were in the wrong place, possibly surrounded, and their entire mission timeline had just been shattered. Morrison gathered the team leaders for a quick conference while the rest maintained security in a tight circle. Daniel knelt in the wet grass, his rifle pointed into the darkness, listening to the jungle sounds around them. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves could be the enemy closing in. His heart was pounding, but his breathing remained steady and controlled. This was the moment where training took over, where instinct replaced conscious thought. Morrison made the call. They'd proceed with the mission despite the compromised insertion. Turning back wasn't an option because the extraction helicopter wouldn't return until the scheduled time, and staying put in their current location meant getting caught at daybreak. Their only choice was to move forward, hit the target, and hope they could make it to the extraction point before the enemy figured out where they were. It was a terrible set of options, but in combat, you rarely got good choices. You took the least bad option and made it work. They moved through the jungle in single file, each man staying within arm's reach of the person in front of him. Daniel was positioned in the middle of the formation, close enough to reach anyone who might get hit. The jungle at night was a living thing, full of sounds and movement that could hide an army or just be the natural wildlife going about its business. They communicated through hand signals and brief whispered words, every sense straining to detect danger before it was too late. The temperature was still over 80 degrees, and within minutes, Daniel's uniform was soaked with sweat. The weight of his medical gear dug into his shoulders, but he'd long since learned to ignore physical discomfort. Pain was temporary and irrelevant when people's lives depended on you. They'd been moving for almost an hour when the point man suddenly raised his fist, the signal to freeze. Everyone dropped to one knee, weapons ready. Daniel could see Morrison creeping forward to see what had caused the halt. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Then Morrison returned and passed the word back. There was an enemy patrol moving perpendicular to their route, about 50 meters ahead. They'd have to wait for them to pass. The team settled into absolute stillness, becoming part of the jungle itself. Daniel could hear the enemy soldiers talking in low voices, the clink of their equipment, the sound of their boots on the trail. They passed within 30 feet of the American position and never knew how close they'd come to walking into an ambush. Once the enemy patrol had moved on, the team continued toward the objective. They reached the target area just before 4 in the morning, exactly as planned, despite the insertion problems. The enemy staging area was larger than intelligence had suggested. Instead of a simple supply cache, they were looking at a substantial base with multiple buildings, guard positions, and what appeared to be a communication setup. Morrison made another quick decision. They'd plant charges on the largest supply bunkers and the communications equipment, then get out fast. The demolition specialists went to work, while the rest of the team formed a security perimeter. Daniel found himself watching a dirt path that led into the base, his finger resting lightly on his rifle's trigger. Everything was going smoothly, too smoothly, and that made him nervous. In his experience, operations that went perfectly were just building up to something worse. He was proven right 7 minutes later when one of the guards on the far side of the base started shouting. Someone had spotted something, and within seconds the entire area erupted into chaos. Lights came on, more voices joined the alarm, and the American team's window for a quiet exit slammed shut. Morrison ordered everyone to fall back to the rally point, but before they could execute the withdrawal, gunfire erupted from multiple directions. The enemy had reacted faster than anyone expected, and now the American team was caught in the open. Daniel saw one of the demolition specialists go down, hit in the leg. Without thinking, he sprinted across 20 feet of open ground while bullets kicked up dirt around him. He reached the wounded man, a sergeant from Texas named Rodriguez, and dragged him behind a fallen log. Rodriguez was cursing and trying to raise his rifle, but his left leg was a mess, the femur clearly broken by the bullet's impact. Daniel worked with practiced efficiency, cutting away the torn fabric of Rodriguez's pants to expose the wound. The bullet had gone clean through, which was good, but it had hit the bone and created a compound fracture, which was very bad. Bone fragments protruded through the skin, and blood was pumping out in rhythmic spurts. Femoral artery damage, Daniel's mind automatically catalogued. Rodriguez had maybe 3 minutes before he bled out. Daniel got a tourniquet around the upper thigh and cranked it down hard, ignoring Rodriguez's screams. The blood flow slowed to a trickle. Then he jabbed a morphine syringe into Rodriguez's arm and started packing the wound with gauze. The firefight intensified around them, the distinctive crack of AK-47s mixed with the heavier sound of American M16s. Someone was shouting for covering fire. Explosions rocked the enemy base as the demolition charges began detonating, sending pillars of flame into the pre-dawn sky. Daniel kept working on Rodriguez, splinting the leg to prevent further damage to the artery. He could hear Morrison on the radio calling for an emergency extraction, explaining that they had wounded and needed immediate air support. The response wasn't encouraging. The nearest gunships were 30 minutes out, and the extraction helicopter couldn't come in until the landing zone was secured. Another soldier went down, this time hit in the chest. Daniel left Rodriguez in the temporary care of another team member and low-crawled to the new casualty. It was Morrison himself, the captain who'd been leading the operation. The wound was bad, a sucking chest wound that meant at least one lung was punctured. Morrison was struggling to breathe, his face already turning grey. Daniel rolled him onto his injured side to keep blood from filling the good lung, then slapped a plastic seal over the entrance wound to prevent air from getting sucked into the chest cavity. Morrison tried to say something, but Daniel told him to save his strength and keep breathing. They'd get him home. Daniel had made that promise before, and he intended to keep it now. The team was in a desperate situation. They were outnumbered, taking casualties, and daylight was coming fast. Once the sun rose, their position would be completely exposed. The enemy was attempting to flank them, and it was only a matter of time before they succeeded. One of the team leaders, a staff sergeant named Hayes, took command and organized a fighting withdrawal. They'd move back toward the extraction point in bounds, half the team providing covering fire, while the other half moved, then switching. It was basic infantry tactics, but executing it while carrying wounded men through dense jungle under fire was anything but basic. Daniel found himself helping to carry Morrison on an improvised stretcher made from 2 rifles and a poncho. Every step was agony, not from physical pain, but from the knowledge that every bounce and jostle was causing Morrison more suffering. The captain had stopped trying to talk, focusing all his energy on breathing. His skin was cold and clammy, classic signs of shock setting in. Daniel kept checking his pulse, monitoring how fast his heart was beating, calculating how much time they had before Morrison's system started shutting down. It wasn't enough time. They needed that helicopter now, not in 30 minutes. They'd made it about half a mile when they were hit again. This time, the enemy had set up a hasty ambush along the route they were using. The front of the American column walked right into a wall of automatic weapons fire. 2 more men went down in the first burst. Daniel and the others carrying Morrison dove for cover behind a small rise in the ground. Bullets snapped through the air above them, clipping leaves and branches. Someone threw a smoke grenade to provide concealment, and the jungle filled with purple smoke that swirled and drifted in the humid air. Hayes was screaming for the machine gunner to suppress the enemy position, but the machine gunner wasn't responding. Daniel looked over and saw why. The kid, barely 19 years old, was lying face down with his weapon beside him, not moving. Daniel knew immediately that he was gone, but they needed that machine gun. He crawled over, checked for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find, then grabbed the M60 and dragged it back to their position. He'd never been trained on the weapon, but he'd watched others use it enough times to understand the basics. He lined up on where the enemy fire was coming from and pressed the trigger, sending a stream of tracers into the jungle. The heavy weapon bucked against his shoulder, but he held it steady, walking the fire back and forth across the enemy position. The suppressive fire bought them enough time to reorganize. Hayes got a head count, and the news wasn't good. They'd started with 12 men, and now they were down to 9 effective fighters, plus 3 wounded, including Morrison. They were low on ammunition, exhausted, and still over 2 miles from the extraction point. But Hayes refused to leave anyone behind. They'd carry the wounded, fight their way through, and get everyone home. That was the promise every soldier made to his brothers, and Hayes intended to keep it. If you've been listening to this story and feeling the tension build, imagine being there in that jungle, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether you lived or died. These were ordinary Americans, guys who grew up playing baseball and working summer jobs, now facing an impossible situation thousands of miles from home. And if this story is hitting you right, if you're invested in what happens next, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We're dedicated to telling the stories of forgotten American heroes, the men and women who did extraordinary things that history tried to erase. All right, back to Daniel and his team, because things are about to get even more intense. They continued moving toward the extraction point, but their pace had slowed to a crawl. Carrying the wounded through the jungle was brutal work. The terrain was rough, full of vines and roots that caught at their feet. The undergrowth was so thick in places that they had to hack their way through with machetes, and all the while they could hear the enemy pursuing them, getting closer. The sound of their voices carried through the trees, coordinating their search. It was only a matter of time before they caught up. Daniel had taken over as the primary medic for all 3 wounded men. He'd check on each of them during every halt, changing bandages, administering morphine, monitoring vital signs. Rodriguez was stable for now, though he'd need surgery soon to properly set that leg. Morrison was deteriorating. His breathing had become more labored, his pulse weaker. The chest seal was holding, but Daniel suspected there was internal bleeding he couldn't do anything about here in the jungle. The 3rd wounded man, a specialist named Chen, had taken a bullet through the shoulder. It was painful, but not immediately life-threatening, and Chen insisted on walking despite the injury. They reached a small stream around 6 in the morning, with the extraction point still more than a mile away. The sun was fully up now, burning off the morning mist and turning the jungle into a steam room. Hayes decided they needed to cross the stream and set up a defensive position on the far side. If the enemy caught them in the open water, they'd be slaughtered, so they had to move fast. Daniel helped carry Morrison across, holding the makeshift stretcher above his head to keep the captain dry. The water was chest deep and moving fast, trying to sweep them downstream. Daniel's boots slipped on the rocky bottom, but he managed to keep his footing. They'd just gotten Morrison to the far bank when the enemy hit them again. This time there was no warning, just the sudden eruption of gunfire from the jungle behind them. The last few men still in the water were caught in the open. One of them, a corporal named Jackson, took a round in the back and went under. Daniel dropped Morrison's stretcher and plunged back into the stream. He found Jackson floating face down, the water around him already turning red. Daniel flipped him over and grabbed him by the load-bearing vest, dragging him toward the bank while bullets churned the water into foam around them. He got Jackson to shore and immediately checked for a pulse. It was there, weak but present. The bullet had entered just below Jackson's right shoulder blade, and there was no exit wound, which meant the round was still inside him, probably lodged near his spine. Jackson was unconscious, breathing but unresponsive. Daniel cut away his uniform shirt and applied a pressure bandage to the entry wound, then carefully rolled him into the recovery position. There was nothing more he could do here. Jackson needed a surgeon, and he needed one hours ago. Hayes was on the radio, begging for the extraction helicopter to come early. The response crackled back through the static. Gunships were inbound, 5 minutes out. The extraction bird would follow them in, but the landing zone had to be cold before they'd risk coming down. Cold meant no active enemy fire, which seemed like an impossible requirement given their current situation. But Hayes had a plan. He'd split the team, sending half ahead to the extraction point to secure it, while the rest stayed behind to hold off the enemy and protect the wounded. It was a calculated risk, dividing their already small force, but they were out of good options. Daniel volunteered to stay with the rear guard. Someone had to stay with the wounded, and he was the only one with the medical training to keep them alive. 4 other soldiers stayed with him, including Hayes, who refused to leave anyone behind. The rest of the team moved out, carrying as much ammunition as they could spare to the forward position. Daniel watched them disappear into the jungle and wondered if he'd ever see any of them again. Then he turned his attention back to his patients. Morrison's breathing had become even more shallow, and his lips were turning blue from lack of oxygen. Daniel knew the captain was dying, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The gunships arrived with the roar of turbine engines and the devastating firepower that had earned them the nickname Cobra. They made strafing runs on the enemy positions, their rockets and miniguns tearing through the jungle with terrible efficiency. For a few precious minutes, the enemy fire slackened as they took cover from the aerial assault. Hayes used the opportunity to move the wounded another 100 yards closer to the extraction point. Daniel and 2 others carried Morrison, while the remaining soldiers provided security and helped Rodriguez hobble along on his one good leg. Jackson was carried by the 4th man, still unconscious and growing paler by the minute. They could hear the extraction helicopter coming in, its rotors beating the air like thunder. Hayes radioed the forward team and got confirmation that the landing zone was relatively secure. They had maybe a 5-minute window before the enemy regrouped and resumed their assault. It was going to be tight, but it was their only chance. They broke into a stumbling run, as fast as they could move while carrying the wounded. Daniel's lungs burned and his legs felt like rubber, but he pushed through the exhaustion. Morrison's life depended on reaching that helicopter. They burst out of the jungle into a small clearing where the helicopter was already touching down. The forward team was laying down suppressive fire into the tree line, keeping the enemy's heads down. Daniel and the others ran for the aircraft, bent low beneath the spinning rotors. They loaded Morrison first, then Jackson, then Rodriguez. The helicopter's crew chief was shouting something, but Daniel couldn't hear him over the engine noise. He climbed aboard and immediately went to work on Morrison, trying to stabilize him for the flight out. The helicopter lifted off just as enemy fire began impacting around the landing zone. Green tracers reached up toward them like deadly fingers, but the pilot was already banking away, gaining altitude and speed. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd fought their way out and gotten the wounded to safety. Daniel looked down at Morrison and saw that the captain's eyes were open, looking at him. Morrison's lips moved, forming words Daniel couldn't hear, but he understood anyway. "Thank you." Then Morrison's eyes closed and his body went slack. Daniel checked for a pulse and found none. He started chest compressions, counting in his head, trying to force Morrison's heart to beat. The crew chief joined in, providing rescue breaths while Daniel compressed. They worked on Morrison for the entire 20-minute flight back to base, refusing to give up, refusing to let him go. But sometimes, willpower isn't enough. Sometimes the wounds are too severe, the damage too extensive. Morrison was declared dead on arrival at the base hospital, despite Daniel's best efforts. The rest of the team made it out alive. Rodriguez would spend 6 months recovering and learning to walk with a permanent limp, but he'd survive. Jackson remained in a coma for 3 weeks before finally waking up, paralyzed from the waist down. The bullet had severed his spinal cord. Chen recovered fully and returned to duty within a month. Out of the 12 men who'd gone into Cambodia that night, 3 came back dead, 3 came back permanently disabled, and the rest carried invisible scars that would last a lifetime. Daniel received the Silver Star for his actions during the operation, though the citation was deliberately vague about where and when the events occurred. The mission itself remained classified for decades, officially denied by the government whenever anyone asked about American operations in Cambodia during that period. The men who were there were told never to speak about it, threatened with prosecution if they broke their silence. For years, Daniel kept that promise, carrying the memories alone. He finished his tour in Vietnam and came home to Kansas in the summer of 1969. His girlfriend Sarah had married someone else while he was gone, and his father had passed away from a heart attack 6 months earlier. The town looked the same, but Daniel had changed in ways that made it impossible to go back to the life he'd planned. He couldn't work on cars and pretend nothing had happened. He couldn't sit in church and listen to sermons about a loving God when he'd seen good men die for reasons nobody could adequately explain. Daniel drifted for a while, taking odd jobs and trying to figure out where he fit in a world that seemed to have moved on without him. He attended the funerals of Morrison and the other 2 men who died in Cambodia, though the families were never told the real circumstances of their deaths. The official story was a training accident. Daniel stood in the back of Morrison's funeral, watching the captain's widow and 3 young children, and felt the weight of all the things he couldn't say crushing down on him. He wanted to tell them that Morrison had been a hero, that he'd stayed with his men even while dying, that his last thoughts had been about getting everyone home safely. But he couldn't say any of that without breaking his oath of silence. He eventually found his way to nursing school, using the GI Bill to pay for his education. It made sense in a way that nothing else did. He'd spent a year keeping people alive under the worst possible conditions. Maybe he could continue that work in a place where he had better tools and brighter lights. He graduated near the top of his class and took a job in a trauma center in Kansas City. The emergency room became his new battlefield, and every patient who survived became a small victory against the darkness he'd witnessed. Years passed, and Daniel built a quiet life. He married a fellow nurse named Linda, and they had 2 daughters. He rarely spoke about Vietnam, even to his family. The memories were locked away in that box he'd created so long ago, only coming out in dreams that left him sweating and gasping in the middle of the night. Linda learned not to ask questions about the nightmares, and the girls grew up knowing their father had been in the war, but having no real understanding of what that meant. In 1991, when Daniel was 47 years old, something unexpected happened. A newspaper reporter doing research on classified Vietnam operations managed to piece together parts of the Cambodia story. He tracked down several members of the team and convinced them to talk, arguing that enough time had passed and the public deserved to know the truth. Daniel was reluctant at first, but when he learned that Rodriguez and Hayes had already agreed to be interviewed, he decided to add his voice to the record. The article was published in a major magazine and caused a minor sensation. Finally, after 23 years of silence, the truth about that October night came out. The government neither confirmed nor denied the details, maintaining their official position that no such operation had occurred. But the men who were there knew the truth, and now the public did too. Daniel received letters from all over the country, from veterans thanking him for telling the story, from families of other soldiers who'd been on similar missions and never came home, from people who just wanted him to know that his service mattered. One letter in particular moved him deeply. It was from Morrison's oldest daughter, now a woman in her 30s, with children of her own. She wrote that for her entire life, she'd been told her father died in a training accident, something senseless and preventable. Learning the truth, that he died leading his men in combat, trying to save lives and complete a critical mission, had changed how she understood his death. It gave meaning to a loss that had haunted her family for decades. She thanked Daniel for his efforts to save her father and for finally telling the truth about what happened. Daniel kept that letter in his wallet for the rest of his life. It reminded him that silence, even when mandated by authority, could be its own form of betrayal. The men who died in that jungle deserved to have their stories told, their sacrifices acknowledged. They weren't training accidents or unfortunate casualties of a conflict that officially never happened. They were heroes who'd done their duty in impossible circumstances, and the American people had a right to know about them. In 1998, Daniel attended a reunion of Special Forces veterans in Fort Bragg. Many of the men from that night in Cambodia were there, older now, grayer, but still bound by the shared experience of combat. They spent hours telling stories, remembering friends who hadn't made it, processing trauma that had been bottled up for 3 decades. Rodriguez showed up on crutches, his leg still giving him trouble after all these years. Jackson came in a wheelchair, paralyzed but alive and surrounded by a large family that clearly adored him. Hayes, who'd led them out of that jungle, broke down and cried when he saw everyone together again. Daniel realized something important during that reunion. He'd spent so many years focusing on the men he couldn't save, on Morrison and the others who'd died, that he'd forgotten about all the ones who lived. Rodriguez was alive because Daniel had stopped the bleeding from his shattered femur. Jackson survived because Daniel had pulled him from that stream and kept him breathing long enough to reach help. Chen, who'd also attended the reunion, had a full life and career because a wound that could have been fatal was treated quickly and effectively. The math of combat was brutal, but Daniel had shifted the equation in favor of life as often as he could. Daniel retired from nursing in 2003 at the age of 59. He'd spent 34 years working in emergency medicine, and the toll had accumulated in his body, if not his spirit. His back was shot from years of lifting patients, his hearing was compromised from too many nights in Cambodia and too many years in loud trauma centers, but his mind remained sharp and his hands steady. He and Linda moved to a small house near a lake in Missouri, where Daniel spent his days fishing and finally processing all the things he'd kept locked away for so long. He started writing a memoir, not for publication, but for his daughters and grandchildren. He wanted them to understand who he'd been, what he'd done, and why it mattered. The words came slowly at first, painful to put on paper. But as he wrote, something shifted inside him. The memories that had seemed like burdens became stories worth preserving. The guilt he'd carried for surviving when others didn't began to ease, replaced by gratitude that he'd been given the chance to make a difference. In 2015, at the age of 71, Daniel received a phone call that changed everything one more time. It was from the Department of Defense, informing him that after extensive review, several previously classified operations from the Vietnam era were being officially acknowledged. The Cambodia mission was among them. More importantly, the review board had determined that Daniel's actions during that operation warranted a higher recognition than the Silver Star he'd received. He was being awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration for valor. The ceremony took place at the Pentagon, attended by his family, surviving members of his team, and various military dignitaries. Daniel stood at attention while a general read the citation, describing in detail the courage and skill he displayed under fire, how he'd repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to reach wounded men, how he'd provided life-saving medical treatment in conditions that would have overwhelmed most trained physicians, how his actions directly resulted in multiple soldiers surviving injuries that would normally be fatal. When the general pinned the medal to Daniel's chest, Rodriguez stood up in the audience and started clapping. Then Hayes joined him, then Jackson in his wheelchair, then everyone else. The applause went on for several minutes, and Daniel stood there with tears streaming down his face, finally receiving the recognition that had been denied for almost 50 years. But more than the medal, what meant something was seeing his daughters in the front row, their faces filled with pride as they finally understood the magnitude of what their father had done. Daniel passed away in 2019 at the age of 75, surrounded by family. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including dozens of veterans whose lives he'd saved or impacted over the decades. They told stories about him, about his calm under pressure, His refusal to give up on anyone, his dedication to the principle that every life mattered. The local news covered the funeral, and the reporter mentioned that Daniel Reed represented a generation of Americans who'd served their country without seeking glory, who'd done extraordinary things in the shadows and then come home to live ordinary lives. His memoir was published posthumously, edited by one of his daughters who worked as a journalist. It became a small bestseller, not because it was filled with dramatic action, though there was plenty of that, but because it was honest about the cost of war and the burden carried by those who fight it. Daniel wrote about the men he couldn't save with the same careful detail he used to describe the ones who survived. He never portrayed himself as a hero, just a man doing his job under terrible circumstances, trying to make a difference, one patient at a time. The house where Daniel grew up in Kansas is still standing, though it's been renovated several times over the years. There's a small historical marker in the front yard now, placed by the local historical society, noting that this was the childhood home of Daniel Reed, Distinguished Service Cross recipient and forgotten American hero. School groups sometimes visit, and local veterans give talks about Daniel's life and the importance of honoring those who serve. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Daniel's life is something less visible and more profound. There are men and women alive today because of what he did in that Cambodian jungle in 1968. Rodriguez lived long enough to see his grandchildren grow up. Jackson, despite his paralysis, went on to become an advocate for disabled veterans and touched thousands of lives through his activism. Chen had a successful career in education, teaching high school history and sharing his experiences with generations of students. The ripple effects of Daniel's actions extended far beyond that single night, touching families and communities in ways that can never be fully calculated. Daniel's story reminds us that heroism isn't always about grand gestures or dramatic last stands. Sometimes it's about showing up when things are at their worst and doing what needs to be done, even when you're terrified, even when the odds are impossible, even when nobody will ever know what you did. It's about the quiet courage of the medic running into gunfire to reach a wounded soldier, the steady hands treating injuries by flashlight in a hostile jungle, the refusal to abandon anyone regardless of the personal cost. The operation that officially never happened produced heroes who were officially never recognized, at least not for decades. Men like Daniel Reed fought a shadow war on behalf of a country that denied they were even there, and they did it without complaint or expectation of reward. They believed in something bigger than themselves, in the bond between soldiers, in the sacred duty to protect and preserve life, even in the midst of death and chaos. When we think about American heroes, we often picture men storming beaches or raising flags on mountain peaks. Those images are powerful and important, and they should never be forgotten. But we should also remember the medics like Daniel, the ones who carried 40 pounds of medical equipment through hostile jungles, who kept working even when exhausted and scared, who measured success not in enemies killed, but in friends kept alive. Their heroism was quieter but no less significant, and their stories deserve to be told and remembered. Daniel Reed never wanted to be called a hero. He'd probably be uncomfortable with this entire story, preferring to deflect attention to the men he served with or the patients he treated over his career. But that's part of what made him heroic. Real heroes rarely think of themselves that way. They're just doing what they believe is right, what their training prepared them for, what their conscience demands. They're ordinary people who, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, choose to act rather than freeze, to help rather than hide, to give everything they have in service of others. The year was 1968, and a young man from Kansas went to war in a conflict that would divide his nation and haunt his generation. He didn't ask to be there. He didn't choose the mission or the circumstances. But when his moment came, when lives hung in the balance and every decision mattered, Daniel Reed proved that one person with courage and compassion could make an enormous difference. His name may not be as famous as other war heroes, but for the men who came home because of him, for the families who got to hold their loved ones again, Daniel Reed was nothing less than a miracle worker in combat boots. And that's a legacy worth remembering.